Dear friends, one of the research topics that I pursue from time to time in our section meetings is the MacKaye family. I did a presentation video on Percy MacKaye last year, and I've talked about Percy's friendship with the poet Albert Steffan. Tonight, I want to talk about Percy MacKaye's daughter, Arvia. She was a poet, biographer, artist, eurythmist, sculptor, and educator. Here are some of her artworks. Here's a picture of her standing with one of the actors in her father's Mask, Sanctuary. Tonight I want to focus on just one aspect of Arvia's biography, and I'll mostly let Arvia present herself in her own words. As a young woman, age 21, shown at that age in this photo, Arvia found her way to Dornach in search of Rudolf Steiner. She hiked there alone from southern Germany with a knapsack on her back. She had heard about Rudolf Steiner from a person in the United States who was a friend of her aunt, Hazel MacKaye. Hazel was her father Percy's sister, and she is another interesting MacKaye, a writer and a crusader for women's rights. Arvia's aunt Hazel was friends with a woman named Irene Brown, who later played an important role in the founding of the Waldorf School in New York City, and whose cousin, by the way, William Scott Pyle, married Meta Voller. And William Scott Pyle, by the way, did this compelling sketch of Rudolf Steiner lying in state. Now, Irene Brown must have been a compelling individual because although Arvia didn't know many details about Rudolf Steiner or theosophy or anthroposophy, such as it was at the time, something in what she heard from Irene Brown motivated Arvia to seek out Rudolf Steiner. It's important to note that Arvia came of age during and after World War I, that great catastrophe at the beginning of our modern era. Or, as Rudolf Steiner would have put it, at the beginning of the Age of Light. Like many young people of today or any era, Arvia felt that new spiritual initiatives were urgently needed for the health and well-being of humanity and the world. She was part of that youth movement that we hear so much about. She went to Europe to bring about social change and renewal. And while she was in Germany, she seized the opportunity to visit Dornach, where she encountered the ruins of the first Goetheanum. It had burned to the ground a few months before she arrived. Her initial encounter with Rudolf Steiner was when he gave an introductory talk, a brief one apparently, in the Carpentry Hall. But this talk, brief though it was, so inspired her that she knew she had to remain in Dornach, and so she did. And because she was able to remain there in 1923, again helped by her friend Irene Brown, because of this, she was one of the few Americans, the only young American woman, to witness the Christmas Foundation Conference. In her memoirs about the Christmas Foundation Conference, Arvia tells us how she climbed up on some woodworking machinery to claim a high perch, inaccessible to older, more earnest and mature spectators, where she could see and hear the proceedings. Now, she reminds me of the character Fable in the Novalis fairytale of Eros and Fable, if you recall that tale. Fable is the plucky young female spirit of poetry who travels high and low, far and wide, in service to beauty and to the world. So tonight I'll read from Arvia's book, The Power of the Impossible, in which she described her first visit to Dornach, and then from her book that tells about her experience of the Christmas conference. I've also used materials from the biography written and compiled by her sister Christy Barnes, and by her brother-in-law, Henry Barnes, and Henry's book on his father-in-law, Percy MacKaye. Okay, I'll stop the introduction now and allow Arvia to speak in her own words. Our story begins with Arvia hiking from southern Germany to Dornach in 1923. After several adventures on the way to Dornach, I found myself at length climbing a steep Swiss hillside dotted with small cottages, a ruined castle high above, until I came upon an outdoor eating place with rough benches and tables. After I had made some inquiries, a kindly English lady took me under her wing, and in a short time I was seated among several hundred people in a large wooden building farther up the hill. Here, a slight figure in a somewhat worn black frock coat rose and walked to a speaker's stand at the right of a blue curtain which apparently hid a stage where a performance was about to begin. There was gravity in his step. He walked and stood with an erect carriage of the head and shoulders, which immediately gave a sense of power to his otherwise rather delicate build. His wide forehead and the deep, penetrating gaze of his eyes, the rhythm of his gestures as he began to speak, and the resonance of his voice immediately awakened my interest. He was an unusual figure, and his words seemed to flow out of a fullness quite beyond my grasp. As I listened, his simplicity and warmth amazed me. This was Rudolf Steiner, a unique personality in Europe at the time, author and lecturer, a pioneer thinker of this 20th century. He spoke only briefly in introduction to the performance, yet my one encompassing memory of that afternoon was of the commanding depth of this man, who spoke so simply, here, in a wooden barracks on a Swiss hillside. A startling sense of immediate spiritual reality imbued his words and bearing with an extraordinary quality of life that had an awakening effect upon the listener. And I remember so well, as I ran down that steep hillside in the dark on my way back to rejoin my friends, I remember what I said: I shall come back here no matter what happens. Well, Arvia did come back, and she heard lectures and met Rudolf Steiner, who gave her advice on her sculpture work and who also wrote out for her 2 meditations in English. Now let's continue with Arvia's description of the Christmas conference. The Dornach Hill in deep snow, brilliant starry nights, cold, sparkling, clear days, the ruins of the old Goetheanum, the gray, charred concrete lower structure, partially swept by drifts, a gaunt and mute reminder of the tragic night 1 year ago. Behind the ruins and just above them on the hill, the low barracks of the carpentry shop. Here, during the days prior to the Christmas conference, intense activity had been going on. The walls of the small auditorium, situated in part of this building, were being ripped out on 2 sides to open the hall toward the adjoining outer workshops. In this way, it was hoped that the many people, some coming from distant parts of the world, who had sent word that they were arriving for the conference, in this way they would be able to see and, in any case, to hear something. No one had anticipated such a large number. There was an atmosphere of intense expectation and preparation. Then, overnight, people began to arrive. On the 24th, long processions came climbing up the hill, through the snow, past the ruins, along the winding paths that mount steeply from the valley below. All of them converged upon this small, weather-beaten door of the carpentry shop. Inside, the auditorium and adjoining workshops gradually became packed to overflowing as the people streamed in. Tightly placed chairs filled every bit of available floor space and the stage as well. People sat upon piles of planks in the background, on workbenches, and on anything they could find. It was impossible to heat the whole enlarged space adequately in the bitter cold, and especially out in the farther areas while people sat wrapped in heavy overcoats and blankets. Young people were asked to give up their seats to the arriving visitors, so many of us stood along the walls at the rear or perched upon window ledges. Finding myself near a big machine for sawing lumber, I eagerly climbed up onto it and found myself a somewhat precarious seat on a small metal slab. From here, I was fortunate to be able to look out over the heads of the assembled people to the small speaker's stand placed at the far end of the auditorium, from which Rudolf Steiner was to speak. This perch being suitable only for a young climber, this perch I was fortunately able to keep throughout the conference. A sense of profound earnestness, of almost breathless expectation, and high festivity pervaded the gathering. There seemed to be so much going on in the way of last-minute preparations, but then, at 10 a.m., Rudolf Steiner stepped to the podium. The calm, moving dignity of his frail form, clad in black, against the blue curtains, the power and erect carriage of his head, the profound kindness and gravity of his features, the unforgettable depths of his gaze. These rise once more in memory. For a long moment he stood silent, as was his custom before he spoke, an enormous quiet surrounding him. Then his deep voice sounded, and with a few simple, impressive words, he pronounced the opening of the Christmas conference, welcoming all who were present. At this point of her narration, Arvia's history dovetails with the account given in the book with the title The Christmas Conference for the Foundation of the General Anthroposophical Society in 1923-1924. But let's skip all that and go to Christmas morning. On the following day, Christmas morning, at 10 o'clock, Rudolf Steiner enacted the laying of the foundation stone of the General Anthroposophical Society. As he had laid the foundation stone for the Goetheanum building in the earth 10 years earlier, he now laid the foundation stone of the new society in the hearts of its members. Never had I seen him as he appeared then. There was a light from his eyes, a power and majesty about him, which made him give the impression of having grown to great size, and intensity and activity united with a cosmic calm which was breathtaking, indicative of what was to come. He opened this event by giving 3 strong, incisive, measured raps with a gavel upon the speaker's stand, such as those given in the temple in the mystery plays. It was as though the room became thronged with unseen spectators. Then, as he spoke, speaking for the first time the words of the Christmas Foundation mantra, it was as though he spoke in this little carpentry shop not only to the whole earth, but to the assembled heavens, as though he became like a sun, light outpouring, his voice like gold, a Michaelic fire infusing his words. Something poured forth of a magnitude, and in a realm of such awakened consciousness on this Christmas morning that can only be likened to a spiritual birth. From my perch in the background, my heart cried out because I realized that something so far beyond my grasp was taking place that it seemed as if it would burst. Then something gave way within me, and I drank in, like a great tide, all that followed, knowing that only in later incarnations would I approach any adequate realization of what was actually taking place.